Bruce and I came to Brookings around the same time. He is a 30-year, or 29-year, I guess, veteran of the intelligence community, not just the Central Intelligence Agency, but he also did significant stints at the National Security Council staff in the White House, working both on the Middle East and on South Asia. And he's not only a superb analyst, but I can attest that he is a very good diplomat and policymaker as well. And he runs our intelligence project here in the foreign policy program. So let's get started just with Bruce giving you the short version of what is a book much meatier than the thinness of it would suggest. It's packed with information, a lot of which was new to me, and it has a very powerful thesis, which, Bruce, if you would share with the group, and then we'll take it from there.
Sure. Thank you, Strobe, for being here. Thank you for that very kind introduction. Thank all of you for coming. What we won is a book about a successful intelligence operation. The war in Afghanistan, or more properly, the war against the Soviet 40th Red Army in Afghanistan, that began on Christmas Eve, December 1979, and ended in December 1979, ended in February 1989 with the retreat of Soviet forces across the Amur River back into the Soviet Union, was a global game changer. One part of that is pretty obvious. The war ended the myth of the invincibility of the Soviet Army. From 1942 on, the Soviet Union had never lost a battle. The perception was the Red Army was invincible. It was not. It was defeated in Afghanistan, and to add insult to injury, it was defeated by basically illiterate Afghan tribesmen assisted by the United States Central Intelligence Agency. The Soviet Union would probably have collapsed at some point anyway, but the Afghan war turns out to have been a precipitating event in making that happen. February 1989, the Soviets leave. Within 6 months, the Berlin Wall fell, and even less time, the Warsaw Pact as a military alliance had imploded. For the United States, it was a remarkably cheap victory. It's very difficult to know in retrospect exactly how much money we spent on the operation in Afghanistan. Covert operations are by definition covert, and they don't publish how much money was spent. But a conservative estimate is that the US spent between $3 and $4 billion in arming the Mujahideen in the 1980s. At its peak, the CIA task force that ran the operation in Afghanistan had roughly 50 people in it. I would submit to you, in the history of the federal government, there are very few federal projects involving so few people and so little money that had literally so much bang for the buck as this one did. Not only did the Cold War come to an end, but the threat of thermonuclear war, which had stood over the world during the Cold War, essentially came to an end as well. But in retrospect, while we can see it was a global game changer in that respect, it was also a global game changer in another respect. This was the beginning of what we now refer to as the global jihad. I want to be very careful here. The notion that the CIA created al-Qaeda is, in my view, bad history. We did not create al-Qaeda. That's not how we operated in Afghanistan. The CIA in Afghanistan was the quartermaster of a war. That's a phrase Bob Gates gave me in an interview for the book. We didn't train anyone. CIA officers never went into Afghanistan. Not a single CIA officer was wounded or killed in the war. We had no casualties because we took no risks. All the risks were taken by other people, principally the Afghans and the Pakistanis. The book is organized to look at the different players in the war, starting with the Afghan communists and then the Soviets. The Russians made almost every conceivable bad decision you could make in this war, beginning with the intervention to start it, which the CIA completely was surprised by. The Soviets' leadership was aging, ill, largely dysfunctional. The principal advocate of going in was the then head of the KGB, Yuri Andropov. He thought it was essential that they went in. Initially, the Politburo did not want to go in and then changed its mind. The Soviets then made another disastrous decision in retrospect, which was to under-resource the war. The Soviet Union put in about 100,000 soldiers to win the war in Afghanistan. In contrast, when it went into Czechoslovakia in 1968, they used 500,000 men. Now, anyone who looks at the map of Czechoslovakia and Afghanistan is going to see that the place where you needed 500,000 men was not Bohemia and Moravia, but the mountains of Afghanistan. That decision meant many things, one of which was they could not close the border with Pakistan, and Pakistan became the base for the Mujahideen. But more than the base, Pakistan, and particularly its intelligence service, the ISI, was the general headquarters of the Mujahideen. It provided the leadership, it provided the strategy, it provided the tactics. And if this war was anyone's war, it was Zia-ul-Haq's war. Zia-ul-Haq was, of course, the military dictator of Pakistan in the 1980s. He is the person who made every critical decision about the war. He liked to tell his director of ISI, I want this to simmer just right. Don't let it boil too much, but always make sure the water is getting hotter and hotter for the Soviet Union. He made the decision to provide arms to the Mujahideen. He organized the political leadership of the Mujahideen to be essentially his puppets. He decided which groups got which equipment. He decided that ISI teams would go into Afghanistan and actually command the Mujahideen on the battlefield. He decided that the Mujahideen would cross the Amur River and take the war into the Soviet Central Asia. And he decided when he wanted to bring the Stinger into the war. I know you all think it was Charlie Wilson's war. It wasn't. It was Zia-ul-Haq's war. The other key outside player was the Saudis. The Saudis matched our $4 billion, dollar for dollar, in government funds. That's well known. What's less well known is that they raised private funds as well. Rich Saudis donated enormous amounts of money to the war. Again, it's hard to know how much, but probably at its peak, Saudi private donations amounted to about $20 million a month going to the Mujahideen. The man who organized that was the then governor of Riyadh province, Prince Salman, who is today the crown prince of Saudi Arabia and heir to the throne. There's, of course, another very famous Saudi who was involved in the story, and that's Osama bin Laden. And I spend a lot of time talking about his role as basically the combat engineer of the Mujahideen. He built a base for the Mujahideen inside Afghanistan with the ISI's help that was state of the art. It had a modern hospital, had a VIP hotel, and had miles and miles of underground tunnels filled with ammunition. Just a brief word on the US role. The US role was a bipartisan, agreed war effort. It was initiated by President Carter. President Carter was caught off balance by the Soviet invasion, but within 2 weeks, Jimmy Carter devised the strategy that the United States would pursue for the rest of the war, and he assembled the coalition of states to support it. Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, China, which was a key supporter of the war effort, Egypt, and the United Kingdom and others. All were brought together. Under the leadership of Carter and Brzezinski, the strategy and tactics of the war and the grand coalition of diplomacy that supported it secretly was developed in the last week of December and the first 2 weeks of January. It had support from Democrats and Republicans. When Ronald Reagan came into office in 1981, he essentially just continued the Carter policy for his entire first term in office. Then, in 1986, at the prodding of Zia, he decided to increase the heat and to bring in the Stinger, and the Stinger, of course, changed the battlefield dynamics. Whether it really led to the Soviet decision to leave is hard to tell from the archives. The Soviets might have left in any case. They were clearly coming to that decision, but the Stinger was obviously a force multiplier in that regard. In that sense, this operation is something pretty rare in the history of the American intelligence community, a success story. There are lots of books about intelligence failures, and a lot of them about CIA failures. But in terms of the objectives the two presidents provided to the CIA, make Afghanistan a quagmire like Vietnam and then drive them out, the CIA succeeded. That it didn't see the global jihad was coming, I think, is in retrospect a clear failure. But that's looking backwards, and it's a little unfair to the people at the time to make those judgments.
In just a couple of minutes, I'd like to open this up to questions that many of you have. And looking out amongst the group, I see a number of people who are deeply knowledgeable, and you'll get some good and even perhaps some tough questions. I should have mentioned in introducing Bruce something that many of you know, and that is that President Obama asked Bruce to chair a policy review on Afghanistan and Pakistan. So if you could kind of leap over this story to the lessons learned and maybe some lessons that weren't learned in our own engagement in Afghanistan.
I think there are a lot of lessons. First thing I would say, though, is we are not fighting the Soviets' war. We did not invade Afghanistan unprovoked. We did not go in and kill the communist leader of the country, which we had helped impose on the Afghans before. We went into war because we were attacked by a terrorist organization based in Afghanistan, supported by the Afghan government. Our war has UN legitimacy. The Soviet war was condemned by the General Assembly. The only democracy in the world that voted for the Soviet Union in the 1980s was India. Every other democracy was on the side of the Mujahideen. Their war encountered a true nationalist insurgency. The Mujahideen were able to draw from every element in every ethnic and sectarian part of the country. Uzbeks, Hazaris, Pashtuns, Tajiks, universally. This war is much more a Pashtun uprising. The Taliban is a basically Pashtun organization. The one big similarity is Pakistan, the huge similarity. Pakistan backed the Mujahideen and the CIA in the 1980s. Pakistan backs the Taliban today. Rarely in one generation do you fight the same war over again, but on opposite sides. Essentially, that's what we're doing. And what I think is clear to say is it's a whole lot easier to win when Pakistan is on your side and you're trying to overthrow the government than it is when you're on the other side and you're trying to keep the government in power and Pakistan is trying to subvert it. The other lesson I would say is that it's critical to define the mission. The mission that was given to the agency, first by President Carter and then by Reagan, was clear, understandable. Turn this into the Soviet Union's Vietnam. And in that sense, it was relatively easy to do. It was probably going to be their Vietnam sooner or later anyway. All we were doing was being the quartermaster to make it their war. If you have a mission that's more vague, like, let's say, trying to build a moderate Syrian opposition that is both anti-Assad and anti-ISIS, and which is going to support democracy and freedom, that's a whole lot more complicated covert operation. One of the lessons, keep it simple.
What was President Zia's main motive for committing himself and his country to the extent that he did?
Zia was a true believer. I found a great quote about Zia in reading the memoirs of Benazir Bhutto. She reports that her father, Zulfikar Bhutto, who appointed Zia chief of army staff, went to visit him one time in his home, in his office in Rawalpindi, in his home actually. And he comes into the house, and the entire inside of the house is one picture after another of Mecca, the Kaaba, Medina. And he turned to Zia and said, "You've turned your home into a mosque." And it was really right. Zia was a believer. He believed in the jihad. He wasn't doing this purely for Pakistan national security interests. He was doing this because he believed it was every Muslim's duty to fight the godless, atheist, communist menace and to defeat it in Afghanistan. Zia is a fascinating figure who is yet to have a single English language biography written of him. I think that's a big lacuna in the history of the second half of the South Asia in the second half of the 20th century. We were lucky in the 1980s. There was a bigger evil than America for true believers to fight. It is conceivable you could get another Zia as a military dictator someday in Pakistan. And the problem is there's no more Soviet Union to direct his animus to.
Well, we know who killed Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, Zia.
Right.
Hang the blighter, I think, was the line. Who killed Zia?
Zia's death, he died in the crash of a C-130, just having left a demonstration of the new American main battlefield tank, a demonstration which was a complete disaster. The tank didn't work and it missed the target when it shot at it. He died in the crash of a C-130 leaving there. It is an open question whether it was an accident or sabotage. I think it was probably sabotage. Zia had so many enemies, including the Bhutto family, that it could have been anyone. There is no reliable answer. It is the big mystery of the war in the 1980s. And I think not only is it a mystery, it changed the course. If Zia had lived, the Mujahideen, I think, more likely would have taken Kabul in 1989 or 1990 rather than in 1992. Zia was a much more clever general and manager of the ISI than either the ISI's successors under Benazir Bhutto or Mrs. Bhutto. Benazir Bhutto came into office in 1989, 34 years old. She had no experience in international relations. She had no experience in governing anything. And she had an army and an ISI that basically saw her as the enemy and her as the person they wanted to overthrow. You had a very dysfunctional, the general headquarters of the Mujahideen, in other words, in 1988, lost its commanding general.
And in the crash that you refer to, of course, and you make much of this